All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the June edition of the Community IT Innovators webinar series. Very happy to have everybody here today for this webinar in which we're going to be discussing building your own BYOD policy. Before we get started, wanted to just tell you a little bit about the webinar and provide a few tips. Please ask questions. We want these webinars to be as interactive as possible, and for that to happen, it really helps for us to get questions from you all. So use the question functionality in the GoToWebinar app to ask your questions, and I'll do my best throughout the webinar to answer the questions. We're also going to be live tweeting this webinar, and you can interact with us on Twitter with the hashtag BYOD. You can also talk to us at Community IT. That'll be another great way to engage and also to ask any questions you have. There were a variety of questions that were submitted at the time of registration, and I will do my best to address those during the webinar and also get to them at the end. Please, actually we don't have any polls during this webinar, but I hope to have a few places where I'll stop and just ask free-form questions, and you can use the question and answer box to answer those. If possible, avoid multitasking and focus as much as you can on the webinar. You may just miss the best part of the presentation. Just as a reminder, the U.S. soccer team is done playing for today, so there shouldn't be any reason why you can't now give your full attention to this webinar. Finally, for whatever reason, if you have to duck out early or you missed a part or want to go back and look at something again, we are going to be making the PowerPoint available on SlideShare, and we make every webinar recording available on our YouTube channel. Those can all be accessed from our website, and we'll be sending out links as well with a follow-up email later after the webinar is done. A little bit about our company, Community IT. We're a partner for nonprofits in the DC area that works with the nonprofit community to help them solve strategic and day-to-day IT challenges. Some of the things that make us unique is the strategic approach that we take. We're interested in helping the organizations that we work with achieve their mission, and we believe that the best way to do that is to help provide them with technology solutions that are not only functional but also engage strategically with the organization. We're a collaborative group. We have a team of over 40 staff who work closely together. We collaborate as a team, and we also collaborate with the organizations that we serve. We're deeply invested in the work that the nonprofit community is doing, and we've worked exclusively with nonprofits for over 20 years now. A quick introduction, my name is Johan Hammerstrom. I'm the president of the company, and you can reach me by email. This is my email address, jhammerstrom@communityit.com, and I also am fairly active on Twitter, so feel free to that's probably actually a better way to get in touch with me if you have any questions. I tend to respond to tweet comments a little bit more quickly than emails. So let's get started. Talk a little bit about BYOD, and actually there's prior to the first topic of this agenda, which is a history, I'm going to have a little bit of a glossary, kind of go through some terms that I think you'll find useful and that are important to keep in mind throughout the presentation. So we'll have the glossary, and then I'll go through the history. I want to present an information services model that is going to be really helpful in putting together a BYOD policy. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, talk about the risks versus the benefits. There's really no way to decide what sort of approach your organization should take towards BYOD without really looking at the specific risks and potential benefits that can result from a BYOD policy. So we'll be looking at that. And then we're going to get into sort of the concrete steps that you can follow to build your own BYOD policy. And I want to be clear, this webinar is focused exclusively on the policy. I'll probably mention a few technology solutions in passing as illustrations, but we strongly believe that the appropriate technology solution flows from the needs of the organization that are really encapsulated in a policy. And you really need to take the time to put that policy together first before going out and looking for technology solutions. And then finally, we'll close with 3 case studies, 3 separate examples of different approaches that large and small organizations have taken to fulfilling their BYOD needs. So first, hopefully you know what this means, but in case you don't, BYOD stands for Bring Your Own Device. It's a term that popped up, I don't know, maybe a year or 2 ago, and it really refers to the fact that it really is kind of a result of the pocket computers that we all carry around with us now, generally smartphones. And mobile phones have been around with us for a long time, even phones that could do a lot of computing. But it was really the advent of the iPhone in 2007 that really sort of revolutionized and transformed what you could do with a mobile device. And because it's mobile and because it was so powerful, people started bringing those devices with them. So that's sort of where Bring Your Own Device comes from. There's actually a similar phenomenon that I think people also kind of refer to when they say BYOD, and that is Choose Your Own Device. And so this sort of refers to some of the disruption that's really occurred in a lot of organizations. You know, the old model, the traditional sort of IT department, made all the decisions for you, for the rest of the staff, about what sort of devices you'd have, what sort of apps you would use, you know, and I'll get into some more details of this as we go along. But now, with sort of the more consumer-friendly, devices and computing technology, more people are comfortable picking their own technology and even, preferring one type of technology or device over another, and that's led to this phenomenon of CYOD, or Choose Your Own Device, where the organization still purchases and manages the device, but it's something that's the end user, so to speak, has more say in what device they're going to use. There's another related phenomenon called Bring Your Own App, so BYOA. And in some ways, BYOA is actually becoming, in terms of, oftentimes the IT department especially thinks of BYOD as a threat. And that's something that applies even more to BYOA. And BYOA is the phenomenon where organizations are, basically, whereas staff in organizations are able to choose which apps they want to use to do their work. So hold on, I got some noise here. I'm going to try to mute that out. Hopefully that takes care of it. All right, great. MDM is another term I'll probably touch on, mobile device management. And MDM refers to the set of technologies that you can use to manage mobile devices. And as you can see from some of these terms, mobile device solutions can be helpful in managing some BYOD situations, but in general, they're more applicable in CYOD situations where organizations are providing the device and have control over it. And then finally, we might have time to get into this topic of containers. Containers is kind of the newest sort of computing architecture where you take the data and segment it into a secure location and restrict access to it in that location. And I'll get back to that and talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. So let's move on, kind of a brief history of where this BYOD phenomenon comes from. And it really has to do with both the shrinking size as well as the growing usability of computing technology over the last 50 or 60 years. So you look at kind of a traditional, mainframe or mini computer environment from the 60s or the early 70s, and organizations could afford to basically buy one machine. Many organizations didn't have a computer at all, but those that could would buy one large machine and have highly trained technical computing science staff to sort of run and manage that machine. That obviously all changed in the 80s with the introduction of the personal computer, and that really led to sort of what I would call the quote-unquote, modern or contemporary computing environment that we all work in today, where there's basically a computer on every desk. The workstation or the desktop or the laptop, in some ways, as a form, hasn't changed significantly from when it was first introduced back in the late 70s. It's gotten a lot more powerful, a lot easier to use, but the fact that it's largely a stationary device with a keyboard and a mouse has kind of remained the same. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we now live in an era where there's these mobile devices that are very powerful, that can do a lot of new types of activities and tasks that laptops and desktops couldn't do, and people now take them everywhere. And actually, this photo is a picture that I took on a recent vacation to Disney World, and I was just kind of struck by the number of people checking their smartphones there. So it's interesting that the extent to which that's really impacted not only the work environment, where someone may be bringing their mobile device to work and checking personal, in things like Facebook and whatnot at work, but you can imagine that out of the 4 people seen here checking their smartphones, there's probably 1 or 2 checking up on their work email or, interacting with somebody back in the office. So it's really kind of blurred the line between work time and free time. So it goes in both directions. And I think that's one of the reasons why in general organizations are willing to let people use their own devices, because it makes them they're able to get in touch with them and reach them a little bit more easily. So I think the lesson that I want to draw from all of this is that the increasing personalization and consumerization of technology and of computing power is not something that IT departments or organizations should necessarily fear, because this has really allowed us to empower users to use technology more effectively. And ultimately, that's really the goal of information technology. And that should really be the goal of any IT department, is to really help the organization as a whole and the individual staff in the organization use that technology more effectively. So I think simply banning these sorts of devices altogether is not necessarily the best approach. Finding a way to leverage the power of these devices can really be beneficial for the organization. So really it boils down to this balancing of priorities. What does the organization need? How can the organization benefit? And then what do individuals need, and how can they benefit? And as we go through the risks and the benefits that come from BYOD, I'm going to look at both organizational risks and benefits as well as personal risks and benefits. I'd like to talk a little bit about this information services or information systems model that was created by one of my favorite writers, Ben Thompson, who writes a tech blog called Stratechery. He does a weekly podcast. If you subscribe to his site, he sends you a daily update, and he's really one of the most insightful thinkers right now when it comes to information technology in the whole IT sector. So if you're not familiar with his work, I'd strongly encourage you checking out his site. It's Ben Thompson at stratechery.com. And so he says it's helpful, and this really, I think, if you bear with me for just a minute or two, this may seem like a bit of an academic digression, but I think it does actually provide a really helpful and interesting model for thinking about the challenges of BYOD. He looks at this stack where you start at the bottom with hardware. So the hardware can be, I'll give some examples in a second, actually. You start at the bottom with hardware. The hardware has an operating system that runs on top of it. That operating system is a platform that allows apps to run that people use. Those apps are used to access services, and those services are where the data is stored. So let's put some meat on this on this skeleton. Part of the reason that this model has been sort of opaque to us, over the last 20 or 30 years, is that Microsoft has done such a incredible job of dominating the entire stack. And so generally, we haven't really had to think about these separate layers in that stack I was just showing you, because Microsoft has kind of owned the entire stack. What I mean by that is that between the OS and the services, it was all controlled by Microsoft. So the hardware, most organizations purchase their hardware from, you'll get a workstation, a laptop or a desktop from Dell or HP or Lenovo. It'll probably run Windows. Windows still has, I believe, over 90% of the sector, in 90% of the market in terms of desktop and laptop operating systems. So generally, it runs Windows. On Windows, you can use a variety of applications. The most common are Microsoft Office applications, so Outlook for your email, Word, Excel, PowerPoint. You can run other applications as well. I think some of the most common ones for nonprofits would be Razor's Edge, potentially, QuickBooks for a small organization, maybe Great Plains, Dynamics for a larger organization, your financial accounting package, your database. And those applications access services. And so if you're using Outlook, you're connecting more often than not to an Exchange server. If you're using Word or Excel, you're more often than not opening files that are located on a file server. And those are essentially services. We don't necessarily think of those as services, but basically everybody had their own sort of self-contained universe in their office. And that's changed dramatically over the last 10 years, I would say. And it's changed for two reasons. One, the advent of mobile technology has really disrupted this entire sort of the ubiquity of Microsoft in this stack. And number two, the advent of the internet really has, and specifically software as a service, has really changed how we think about services. And so, I mentioned that Windows was 90%. There were a few holdouts who were still using Mac, but it was largely a Microsoft world. That's changed almost completely. Now, instead of just having PCs, people have tablets, they'll have mobile devices. I think I saw that it was in the first quarter of 2014 that the number of mobile devices exceeded the number of PCs worldwide. I think I'm getting that statistic right, but I think there are now more tablets and mobile devices in use than PCs, and it happened in a remarkably short period of time. And those computing devices have really become a dominant force in the world of information technology. And so that sort of led to this diffusion of operating systems, where now, instead of just having Windows, there's more and more laptops that are running OS 10. The share of the workstation market, or the PC market, is starting to increase for Apple. But then obviously on tablets and smartphones, iOS and Android are the dominant operating systems. So this means that people are no longer just using Outlook installed on their Windows PC to check their email. They're using the iOS mail client on their iPhone to check their email, or they're using the Android mail client on their Android phone to check their email. So the types of apps that are being used are also changing. And then the services are increasingly moving out of the office and into the cloud. And so instead of having an Exchange server on site, a lot of people are moving to Office 365. A number of people are moving to Google Apps. Files are moving out of the local file server into places like Box, Dropbox, OneDrive by Microsoft, and also the databases like Razor's Edge, which used to be run on premise. Now you can run it in the cloud, but you could also go with something like eTapestry or Salesforce for nonprofits, which is solely a web-based application, and so that's the software as a service model. So the world has changed, and I think looking at this information systems model has really kind of reveals the way in which it's changed. So now, instead of having that single stack, you now have a variety of devices: phone, tablet, PC, your web browser, that all run in on different environments, and maybe are trying to access the same services. And this is essentially where the BYOD problem comes from. Because the BYOD is on the bottom, that's your device. What the organization really cares about is the data and the services. The devices that are used to access the data can be important to the organization, but they're not the critical piece. The critical piece is the data, the information. That's what's the asset. And up until now, IT departments have had to manage PCs as sort of a necessary evil. You have to have some way of accessing that data. But as you can see from this model, that's all starting to change. And that's really at the heart of what's creating the BYOD problem. So right now, the world that we live in, and what organizations have really been experiencing over the last, 5-6 years, is that you've got this traditional. See if I can. You've sort of got this traditional this traditional environment here, which is all run and maintained by the organization, where you have a Windows PC, a web browser. It accesses a set of data and services that's maintained by the organization. And then over here, you have people bringing in their iPhones and their iPads and their Android phones and wanting to access the data from over here. And that's where the BYOD problem comes from, because the IT department controls this system here. Is it safe? Is it secure? Is it free from viruses? The IT department has no control over what's happening with these phones, whether it's either physical security or information security of these phones. And that's where the BYOD problem is coming from. However, I think there's another way to look at this, and this can be a helpful sort of subtlety or nuance for thinking about BYOD for your organization. Let's see here. Go. Oops. There we go. All right. A lot of organizations are starting to think in this way that's called mobile first, which is instead of deploying or setting up their data and services in a way that sort of lends itself to be accessed by a PC that's managed by the IT department, organizations are now setting up data and services assuming that they're going to be accessed by devices that they have no control over. And so instead of thinking, well, I've got the PC and the web browser that I control, and then the phone and the tablets that someone else brings in, organizations are saying, well, I'm going to assume right off the bat that this is going to be accessed by devices that I have no control over. And so Salesforce is probably a good example of this, where the only way to get to Salesforce is through a web browser or the mobile app. And so, that's basically a mobile first solution. There's no other way to get to it. And now we can kind of see where BYOA fits into this scenario. Bring your own app. So maybe you have the organization providing Salesforce over here, providing Exchange right here, but then you've got staff that are taking all of their notes on Evernote. One of the things that we've seen quite often is that there's maybe a department in the organization that wants to share files with somebody that they're collaborating with outside of the organization. What do they set up and use? Google Apps. So now you've got a Google Apps, a personal Google Apps account that is being used by a variety of staff, and that's being used to share organizational information outside of the organization. So we have this environment where there's information outside of the purview of the IT function at the organization being accessed by devices that are outside of the purview of the IT function. There's information outside that's being accessed by devices that are owned and managed by the organization. So you could have a staff person using their work PC to access that Google Drive account. You could have a staff person using their work PC to access, to store important information in the Google Drive account. Then when they go home, they use their Android tablet to access that same information and modify it. So there's a lot of work happening that's just completely invisible. And that's where the phenomenon of shadow IT comes from. And that's probably happening. Probably happening to some extent at your organization. I think I've in the conversations that I've had with most of the clients that we work with, it's happening to some degree almost everywhere. Um, and so that presents a huge challenge. It's not just at small nonprofit or medium-sized nonprofit organizations. Surveys of CIOs show that this is happening at 70 to 80% of all businesses, of all organizations. And so it's a huge challenge for the IT departments of these organizations to try to manage technology and information effectively given this environment. And this, I think, really kind of demonstrates why looking the other way is no longer really an option, because increasingly staff are savvy enough to set up their own information systems in the cloud and to find ways to access them both from work devices as well as personal devices, and by the same token are savvy enough to find ways to access work information from their personal devices. So, what to do about all of this? I think the probably the best approach is really to tackle it head on, to acknowledge the fact that this is the world that we live in now, and to find ways to provide staff with the tools and the information they need in a secure fashion. And that really starts with looking at the risks and the benefits that come from taking a BYOD or BYOA approach. There are three main risks to allowing to your data and services either being stored in an environment that you're not familiar with or being accessed by devices that are not under your control. There are security risks, information security risks, there are legal risks, and there are financial risks. And I'm going to walk through each one of those in just a second. There are also benefits, though, and again, it's important as you're putting your policy together to really weigh and compare the benefits against the risks. The benefits are user adoption, as I mentioned earlier. I think we all have had the experience of someone maybe in our family, maybe a friend who was never very good with computers, who always seemed to struggle with them, doing all kinds of amazing things with their iPhone. And it's a testament to sort of the friendliness of the iPhone, and also just kind of the approachability of that form factor, that it's allowed people to really use information technology a lot more than they did before. So this really helps address sort of the age-old training problem. That's one of the things that I think those of us who've been in IT for a long time have run into over and over again, which is, how do I, we roll these systems out, but no one uses them. How do we get these technology systems to be adopted? And so on the one hand, while it's kind of scary for us as IT managers to think of our staff setting up these, quote unquote, rogue Google Apps instances and accessing them from devices that we've had nothing to do with, it also speaks to, a level of technical sophistication that I think in another context we all would have really welcomed and supported and encouraged. And so, we want to make sure that as we're putting together the BYOD policy, we're not stifling sort of the way that people are approaching and using technology. There can be cost benefits. I think this is a number of the questions that came up when people registered were, around how do you reimburse staff for BYOD. And there's no one-size-fits-all answer to that. There are a lot of different approaches. There can be cost benefits to that, but there can also be, financial risks as well, which, as I mentioned, we'll get to. And then finally, there's that benefit of flexibility. And I think the more, you allow, and this kind of ties into particularly the degree to which people are working remotely more and more. And again, I think it's unusual nowadays for us to work with an organization of any size that doesn't have at least one person permanently located off-site. You generally working from home, and we work with organizations that have up to 50 or 60% of their staff um, a distributed workforce, working offsite at their home. And so this sort of new era of computing really creates that degree of flexibility. So let's talk first about the benefits. It can potentially reduce hardware and support costs. The hardware costs come obviously if you have some sort of stipend or no stipend at all for reimbursing staff instead of purchasing the equipment for them. And you can have reduced support costs if you require the staff to support their own hardware instead of paying for an IT department to do that. The work flexibility we just talked about. Employee availability, as I sort of touched on earlier, having employees more available more often sort of goes hand in hand with work flexibility, giving people the ability to kind of work when it's giving them more flexibility around their working hours can be a real benefit that an organization can provide. And then, as I mentioned, user adoption and satisfaction. So what are some of the risks? There's the information security, legal, and financial risks. And as we look through these risks, again, I want to kind of look at them through the lens of the organization and then also through the lens of the individual. So the information security risks. One of the big risks that organizations face is data leakage. Critical data and information in your organization is leaking out. So I think the classic and most familiar example that we all know is with email on an iPhone or on a smartphone, where you allow your staff to connect to your email server. Now all of that email is on the staff person's phone. What happens if that phone gets lost? What happens if it gets lost and they didn't have a security code? Now whoever took that phone or found it or stole it has access to organizational information in the form of email. They also have the ability to send and receive email. That can be very, very dangerous depending on what that staff person was using the email for. So that's a serious risk. It can also be a vector into the company, and what I mean by vector is an opening or a method by which bad information, so to speak, can get into the company. And I think we're all familiar with viruses. We're all familiar with malware, and those of you who've been impacted by viruses are familiar with the serious risk that they pose. They can create a lot of downtime. They can corrupt data. They're generally a serious problem. Not to get in the Wayback Machine again, but when I first started out doing this 15, 20 years ago, the vector was a floppy disk, because that was really kind of the one thing that went from network to network or computer to computer. And most antivirus programs had these like floppy disk scanners. You put a floppy disk in your computer and it would start to scan. That all changed in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then email really became kind of the main vector for viruses to move around, because that was the one thing that was really traveling in between networks and allowed for viruses to infect the machine. That has changed. Email now, through the advent of spam filtering and virus filtering systems, it's now actually become much more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult for viruses to enter an organization through email. And so we're starting to see viruses coming in other ways. We had an organization that used Skype. It was an NGO, and they were using Skype to communicate with their staff internationally. And one of their staff members got what looked like a message from one of their colleagues with a file attached to it. They clicked to open it, and it was actually the CryptoLocker virus, and it immediately started encrypting files on the file server. The antivirus software caught it, and we were able to restore all the files from backup, but it just goes to show the degree to which hackers are going to find the easiest way into an organization. And now that email has been not completely locked down, but is a harder target, so to speak, we're going to see more and more malware coming in through BYOA, like Skype, bring your own app, or BYOD through devices. And then there's personal risks that can come around securing information. And the big one is onerous security measures. So you can actually, there's a lot you can do to lock down someone's smartphone, basically saying if you want access to company information, we will require you to have a PIN code on your phone. We reserve the right to wipe your phone. Those may be important steps to take, but they create sort of a risk for that individual. If accessing company information means also giving your organization the ability to wipe your phone, that means that your personal data is at risk, all of your photos, your music, and so forth. And it also means loss of full control of device. And so generally there's no way to really manage an individual's device without having some control over it. And so, it enters into, you have to have some overlap there. So those are the information security risks. Talk a little bit about the legal risks. Part of the problem in looking at legal risks around BYOD is that Congress is kind of way behind the curve on this, not surprisingly. And actually, one of the things that is really interesting right now is the degree to which our society is evolving rapidly with regards to technology. But other aspects of our society, particularly our laws, are not evolving nearly as quickly. And we've kind of seen this with things like net neutrality over the last 6 months or so. And it's certainly the case with BYOD, where there's really no sort of legislation to help guide an organization around what its legal risks are, and case law is currently being worked out. So there may be other legal frameworks that apply to your organization, such as HIPAA compliance, PCI compliance, SEPA compliance. So it's important to kind of be aware of what legal obligations your organization is under with regards to information, but there's no kind of generic or overriding legal framework that can be applied to the BYOD. There could be personal risks. So if your organization is involved in litigation and your device has company information on it, it could be confiscated, as part of that. And the information, all of the information, could be retrieved from the device. So there's this blurring of the personal into the corporate. So it's important for, it's important for individuals to be aware of the risks they're facing with regards to their personal devices by accessing organizational information with those devices. And then finally, there's financial risks. I think one of the big myths of BYOD, and there's a number of articles that kind of get into this, is that providing employees with a stipend can help the organization save money. I think when we've done the analysis, what we've found is that it is almost always a money loser, generally because stipends are often considered a form of compensation, and so they're taxed twice. They're taxed, you pay the tax on paying the employee, and then it's considered part of their income, so they're getting taxed on it. So the amount that the organization is spending is actually reduced right away through taxes. So that's one way in which it can be more expensive. Oftentimes organizations get better deals buying equipment in bulk than an individual can get buying it individually, and so that's another thing to look at and consider. IT support can become entangled, and I think this is something that most IT departments are now very familiar with. Generally, when you update systems, you make a change to a system, you update the Wi-Fi network, you update the email server, and you've done all your due diligence to make sure all of the workstations can connect. Generally, the next day, people start bringing their iPhones in and saying, I'm having trouble connecting to the network, I'm having trouble getting my email. And so now IT, the amount of time that IT needs to spend on supporting individual devices starts to go up. So there's that financial risk as well. So there could be, you kind of look at that as sort of a trade-off. Like on the one hand, you are, providing, maybe you're reducing the amount of time you have to spend training employees on how to use the equipment, but you're potentially increasing the amount of time you have to spend on supporting personal devices. Mobile device management solutions tend to be very expensive. There's certain things that you can do with, so for example, if you're on Office 365 and you're using Exchange, there are some built-in tools that you can use to require devices to have a PIN code, to require them to have a short amount of time before they lock themselves, and also to have the ability to wipe them. So there are certain things that you can do sort of right out of the box with Exchange, but in general, sort of more full-featured mobile device management solutions, like Mobile Iron, for example, tend to be $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 to deploy. And for larger organizations, for medium-sized organizations, 200-300 staff, that can generally fit within the budget. But for smaller organizations, it becomes cost prohibitive pretty quickly. And then personal financial risks, you may not cover full costs. I was there are a lot of I was looking at I was following the BYOD hashtag earlier, and someone had said BYOD means now employees have to pay for the cost of providing their own equipment. So there's kind of that that sense that BYOD means that employees get sort of a raw deal, that the organization is now eliminating a lot of expensive equipment costs and just passing that along to individuals. That, there's potentially some truth to that. At the same time, if individuals are already own equipment that can be used to do their work, does it make sense for the organization to then purchase that equipment as well? So I think a lot of that can come down to organizational culture and how that gets handled. And then the individual can be responsible for their own support, which can be expensive. So how do you build your own BYOD policy? Now that you're kind of aware of the history of BYOD, you're aware of sort of the information systems framework, you're aware of the risks and benefits. What are the steps, the concrete steps that you need to take to build your own BYOD policy? The first step in the process is for you to inventory your data. And this kind of, again, goes back to that information systems framework. Start all the way at the top. What is the data that your organization uses? So there's email, there are files. If you're involved in healthcare, there might be patient medical records. If you're involved in education, there might be student records. If you're doing community service, there might be case management records that you're using. What is the data? So you want to list all of that out. Be as exhaustive as you can. List all of the data out that your organization uses. And then do an assessment of how sensitive is that data. How bad would it be if this data got out? How bad would it be if this data were corrupted? And you especially want to look at any compliance regulations around that data. So I think one of the mistakes maybe, or one of the misconceptions around BYOD that people have is that they don't really think about their data as separate. It's kind of all, well, that's just our data. It all sits, this is kind of that Microsoft mentality in some ways. Well, it all sits on the file server, so I'm going to protect it all equally. This day and age, that's not really possible, and it's certainly not prudent because your medical records are very sensitive, require a high degree of protection. Maybe if you have good policies around how your email system is being used, then maybe email really isn't that big of a deal. Like maybe people really don't use email that often, or they don't use it to communicate information that's that sensitive. And so the email system doesn't need to be as secured as the student information system or the electronic medical records system. So inventorying your data is really important. And then you want to identify the work roles in your organization. And there's always, anytime you embark on an IT project, whether it's business process mapping or doing these sorts of inventories, there's always that moment where you have to decide how general and how specific am I going to be when I list these things out. So you want to, it's a balancing act. You don't necessarily want to list every person in your organization, but at the same time, you don't want to just say executives and staff. And I think as you engage on these two activities at the same time, one will make the other clear. And so as you're inventorying your data, you may realize, okay, patient care is a specific work role in my organization. Development staff, that's another work role. Communications. It will, more often than not, a good place to start with that is with your departments. So, what are the departments that I have in the organization? So you want to identify who needs access to which data. You want to look at remote work requirements. So, do you have caseworkers who need to travel a lot, who are kind of always out in the field, and visiting clients, visiting participants, visiting patients? Does your financial finance department all work from home? Do they need to be able to work remotely? What are the remote work requirements? And then what are the flexibility requirements? So you want to identify the benefits. So once you've done that inventory, then you want to kind of think through each of those work roles and identify those benefits and prioritize them for your organization, and then establish your strategy based on that. You also want to identify the risks for each of the work roles and information types. And I have a matrix I'm about to put up, which might actually be easier. So this is very, very simple, and this is just a simple starting point. You can make it more complex than this. But you would basically, list out your staff. This is very generic. So you got your program staff. They don't need access to medical records. They don't need access to donor contacts. They don't need access to financial system. They don't need access to HR records. They don't need access to any of the sensitive data that this fictional organization has. They need access to email, and they need access to the program management system. And it's been determined that this program management system, the data is not that sensitive. Right, what about your development staff, your mission advancement group? They have access to donor contacts. They don't have access to any of these other things, but they're obviously working with donor contacts on a daily basis. That's very sensitive information. If your donor contact list either got corrupted or leaked out, if you have some very high profile donors and their contact information were to become publicly available, that could be a huge disaster for the organization. And so that's sensitive data that needs to be kept in mind. They also need access to email and grant proposal data, but the grant proposal's not that sensitive. And then finally, your executive staff, they also need access to the donor contacts. They have access to the financial system. They have access to all of this. And so, now you've kind of identified which work roles, which staff need access to which systems, and then what does that mean for the sensitivity of the data that they have access to. So now you can kind of create your risk profile for your different staff. And so as we saw before, the information security risks for program staff, pretty low. They don't have access to much secure information. There aren't any really legal risks involved, and there are no financial risks towards letting them use their own devices. Development staff, as we saw before, there are moderate information security risks. So as you're putting together your BYOD policy, you need to keep that in mind. Probably not going to let them have mobile access to the donor contacts unless it's on devices that you manage closely. There aren't really any sort of legal risks faced by the development staff. It's, if you're sensitive, if your high profile donor contacts leaked out of the organization, you're probably not going to be subject to any legal action, but it's an information security risk. And then the financial risks of letting the development staff use their own devices is probably pretty low. For your executive staff, they have the risks for information getting out are very high because they have access to the financial information. There may be additional legal risks as officers of the organization. They may be subject to additional liability or fiduciary responsibility that other staff don't have, and so you need to protect the information on their devices maybe a little bit more than the other staff. And then finally, there may be more financial risks to letting them use their own devices. If there's sort of an expectation that they always need to be available and always need to be working, that may be, not giving the IT department control over those devices, maybe introducing financial risk. So with that in mind, what are some of the benefits? We've mapped out the risks. If staff have access to their own devices, it could potentially reduce costs. Instead of providing program staff, let's say they use, they're just entering simple information in the field. Most of the staff have a smartphone and they could do it on their smartphone. Maybe that helps to reduce costs instead of providing them all with their own laptops that they're not going to use anyways. And that's actually an important thing to keep in mind, is you may be furnishing your staff with a lot of devices, but are they actually using the devices? There's kind of the flip side of that issue of not paying for staff equipment. The flip side is you're paying for equipment that the staff is not using. Program staff do need to be available on a regular basis, so there's that benefit that you might get from having BYOD policy, a favorable BYOD policy. Development staff need work flexibility, but other than that, they're making calls, they're sitting at their desk, maybe you're using Razor's Edge. Availability isn't as big of an issue. They're working 9 to 5. They already know how to use the system. There's no user adoption there. There's that moderate information security risk. And so, So for the program staff, the best approach is probably just straight BYOD, provide them with a small stipend, and limit their access to information. So they can access emails, and maybe they have some limited access to the program system where they can enter information when they're out in the field, but then maybe in order to file reports or do some additional work, they need to be back in the office working at their workstation. Development staff would have a limited BYOD policy where they could have some access to information from home, but you'd probably be using more of this, as I mentioned before, container approach, where you're providing that information in, through some kind of connection that is temporary and that can be, revoked at any time. And then your executives, and this is probably fairly common, they need work flexibility. They're always working. They always need to be available. They tend to are comfortable with the devices that they're used to. And so if they're familiar with the iPhone and the iPad and that's what they want to use, they might not want to use the laptop or the Surface or whatever it is that the organization provides. They have high information security risks, legal risks, and moderate financial risks. And so the policy there is CYOD. We're going to let the executive choose which device they want to use, but it's going to be purchased by the organization. It's going to be fully managed by the organization. We want to have a really clear line for the executives between the company-owned or the organization-owned devices and their personal devices. We don't want to have that mixing, but at the same time, we want to kind of provide a BYOD-like environment for them, because if we don't give them the iPhone to do their work, they're going to use their personal iPhone. So this is really the kind of the first step towards kind of coming up with the policy. And as you can see, there's no one-size-fits-all policy. You kind of have to look at the specific, situation within your organization. So in the interest of time, I want to go ahead and move on to, I'm just going to run through this really quick, and then when we hit 5 o'clock, anyone who needs to that'll be the end of the formal webinar, but I'll stick around for we'll have some additional time in honor of the World Cup, and I'll stick around as long as I need to answer any questions people have. So 3 case studies. First, Shell. Very, very aggressive BYOD policy. Last year, Shell announced that within the next 5 years, by 2018, 90% of their workforce of 150,000 were going to be completely BYOD. Basically, if you go to work for Shell in 5 years, you need to bring your own device. They're building their own custom authentication system to facilitate that. So they're basically going to have this container approach where you can access the data, but it's completely segmented from the rest of the information on your device. The reason that they chose to do that, they did a lot of surveys. They looked at the issue really closely, and they found that they're basically their prediction is that over the next 10 years, most younger workers are going to want to bring and use their own device. They're not going to want to use a device that's provided for them by the company. And so they wanted to, basically have a system that would appeal to younger workers. And that was essentially the reason that they moved forward with this approach. I think there's also the fact that a lot of their workforce is out in the field, and is not kind of connected to a headquarters, and so it's easier for them to just let them use their own device rather than try to have manage a field worth of devices. On the other hand, IBM, another very large company, has a conservative BYOD policy. So they right now about 20% of their staff use their own device, and they're trying to reduce that even more. They want to increase restrictions on personal device use. So one of the things that IBM did with iPhones is to basically disable the iCloud. And anybody who has an iPhone knows that without iCloud, there's almost nothing, there's very little you can actually do with your iPhone if you don't have access to iCloud anymore. You can't back it up. You can't, any of the photos you take, are not going to be moved on to film strip. And so, while it makes sense for them from a security standpoint, it really kind of, you wonder like how many employees are actually going to want to use their personal device given those restrictions. IBM's rationale for this very conservative approach is security concerns. So they're worried about IP, intellectual property, kind of flowing out of the organization. And their biggest concern was Dropbox. And Dropbox, there was sort of a number of well-known white hat hacks that were done in the last 12 months that sort of demonstrated just how vulnerable Dropbox can be. The most famous was called Dropsmack, where someone found a way to basically hack into, and it was an IT security firm, and they hacked their way in using the CIO's Dropbox account, which was somewhat embarrassing. And I would like to hold us up as something of a model, and taking a more flexible approach with BYOD. So we actually went through the process last year that I've talked through. We ate our own dog food, so to speak. We identified, we inventoried our data, identified sort of the different levels of sensitivity. We identified 3 different work roles, and we did a cost-benefit analysis of various types of BYOD policies for those 3 work roles. And we came up with a device policy that basically, one work role it doesn't have any BYOD. It's all the devices are provided by the company. Those are staff who don't need to be mobile. We had a second group where we have staff who don't have access to a lot of secure information on a regular basis, but they're very mobile and they need to be out in the field a lot. And so those staff have pretty generous BYOD policy. And then we had a third group that is both mobile but also needs access to secure information. And so for that group, we had more of a CYOD policy where we were providing the devices, specifically mobile devices, but then allowing the staff to make some decisions about what they wanted to use. So that was our approach. So that was a bit of a sprint. Right now there's one question, so if anybody else has other questions, feel free to use the question widget to ask your question, and I'll be answering those in just a minute. Before I do, I did want to mention that we're going to have another webinar next month. We've really enjoyed these webinar series. Next month, July 24th from 4 to 5, we're going to be taking another look at SharePoint. For those of you who are familiar with SharePoint, it's kind of a notorious collaboration portal. It's been out for over a decade now. It's kind of getting a second wind because of Office 365, and there are a lot of organizations, specifically nonprofit organizations, that are starting to reconsider maybe their concerns about SharePoint. They're taking another look at it. It's something that we've been looking at pretty closely over the last few months, and we just want to share our lessons learned. Here's sort of, we've been using SharePoint, we've been piloting it in Office 365, and we just kind of want to talk about, what it can do, what our experiences with it have been, and how it might be able to be a good solution for nonprofits. So that's next month, so look for that.